Okay, committee.
They're
live.
We're live.
We're live.
It's from one week.
Okay, so left off.
We were still talking, I thought, about, we had just talked about equalization, and then we were talking about the penalty. Were we done with that conversation about the penalty?
Not sure where he. Did we talk about the rate at which he would have? Should have to contribute. They, meaning districts, should have to contribute to the reserve.
I think
That's what we left off.
Yeah, so if we were gonna have a penalty, what would the rate of that penalty be? Would it be 20%, would it be higher, lower? But I'm not sure if we had come to. Did we straw poll that? We didn't straw, the only two things we've straw polled so far today are, should districts be allowed to raise and above the educational opportunity? And then,
Apologies for interrupting. For those who don't know, we saw the work on this one. Going in for this question, and I have heard the feedback, because I did this in 30 seconds. You can always hear the feedback, so I'll just turn it off real quick. Or at least make sure I find a way to turn it off real quick.
If you saying, could you wait?
My apologies for that.
Higley's fault.
How about now? No. Yeah, I am muted, but
Please stand by. We're experiencing technical difficulties.
you're experiencing the 30 seconds of panic that you go through when everyone's looking at you funny. If it's okay with me, I'm just gonna cancel this meeting and then come back in. My apologies for that.
It was late anyhow.
So sorry.
How about that? Great, we didn't have any answer. My apologies again.
All right. Okay, so we are back.
so we were just trying to get sorted as to where we were in the list of questions, and I
Yes.
believe we had talked about equalization, everyone seemed to be on board, but we had not taken a straw poll, I don't know if we want to, and then, or if the chair wants to. And then we had also talked about penalty, and I believe the next question after, I'm not sure that we didn't straw poll that either. And then the question is, if we are going to do a penalty, what percentage would that penalty be, or that's what amount?
Those were the questions. Seems like we were just on the penalty phase, wasn't it? Like that's trouble.
We didn't stop.
So I started to say, just before we had the little feedback issue, we've only straw polled two things so far today officially. One was, should school districts be allowed to raise and spend above the educational opportunity payment? We said yes, 911. Interesting. And then we had another straw poll for the how we should calculate if there should be a cap, and then if so, how we should calculate that cap. And we did that all as one straw poll. So we set a cap based on a percentage of the educational opportunity payments. And that was 902, mostly because Rebecca wanted to, or Representative Holcomb wanted to make sure she understood the weights before she voted in favor of something like that. And then I don't think we've taken any of the official straw polls. So I don't know if you want to.
We haven't yet. Let's see.
And there's also, we'll be straw polling when we get the official language in the.
Right.
So, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we don't need to take a straw poll on every single
Maybe not, yeah,
line
yeah.
item, but
Yeah.
I just wanted to let you know where we were in terms of what we had.
I think as long as we have given enough direction from our discussion and stuff for Ledge Council and JFO to be able to work with things.
Yeah, so John Gray, legislative council, I would say, feel free to do whatever you want. I find the straw polling extremely helpful for knowing what I need to do.
Okay. So I have a question on that last straw poll.
Yes.
Was that percent limit over the EOP? Is that non-weighted?
That is weighted.
That's
The EOP is
Because
weighted.
the EOP is rated, so we're saying that that's rated, yeah. We did, yeah, so we're being very informal. So I think the way Charlie phrased it was, should we have a cap on the supplemental district spending?
Yes.
Based on a percentage of the educational opportunity payment.
Yes, and I think the committee was in favor of a percentage rather than a dollar amount, because that would adjust with any adjustments to the education opportunity payment. So we didn't have to set a fixed dollar amount in statute.
And Representative Vogel, I just wanted to make sure, I was double sure, I had you as abstaining from that,
I'm just.
or do you want that to be a no?
If you're saying, it depends what you're pulling on. If you're pulling on conceptually, I'm fine conceptually.
Yeah.
I just think we're gonna get a lot of numbers tomorrow. It's really hard to know how this is gonna play out.
And we may have to restraw poll a bunch of
Right, but
things.
conceptually, I'm fine with this issue.
Okay. So that leaves us to the next, we did also talk about asking Ledge Council to come up with two different kind of ways to treat what offsetting revenues would be, and I volunteered to work with Ledge Council to come up with what those might be, and offsetting revenues beyond categorical grants, or we can include those. So I'll work with Ledge Council to come up with that wording. Yeah. Okay. If you want to include that in what gets calculated for supplemental district spending.
And then it'll be available tomorrow.
That's the idea.
That's the theory.
Yeah, one thing I'm just thinking about right now, just before you mention this, if I can toss in, is why would folks report their education fundraising for purposes of this offsetting penalty? So you may need to ensure that there's a mechanism for capital.
It's already there. They're already required to report it, and you can actually go back to the F-33 and the public districts report it. You're talking about the others?
Okay,
But we have this data for publics, we just don't have it
that's
for,
helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Can we ask JFO, Julia, is it easily discernible in the data that you get from AOE as to how much is coming from offsetting revenue and the different categories of offsetting revenue, or is it a single line?
Julie Richter, JFO. No, that's not data that I have from the agency, that I would need to request the data. I don't know if they could provide it by tomorrow. I'm happy to reach out to them. I will also say that just flagging now that in terms of any sort of modeling about any of this proposal, I would need a lot more guidance about the structure, the considerations, private v public, but there's a lot of inherent policy questions underlying all of this that would need to be fleshed out for me to be able to come back with any modeling. Not to mention, I don't know what data is available because I haven't done any about that.
Fair. Okay. Okay, so that then, if yes, we're at the question, if we agree to the concepts we've talked about for school supplemental district spending, and if to be raised by property taxes, we agreed on the equalization idea, right? You just equalized, but we haven't agreed as to whether or not everyone should be contributing to that reserve pool and how that reserve pool should be dedicated. And we don't yet know until we get the math as to how to estimate how much could be contributed into the reserve, the capital, the school construction aid reserve, because we don't know what the base is or what the supplemental district spending may be, and by what districts and how much they might contribute. We don't yet know those questions. Right. Okay. Really hard to then calculate. So, but there was a sentiment, it seemed, that there should be some penalty, but not a large one. So let's talk about that. There's not consensus. Should there be any penalty assessed to school districts when they are doing supplemental district spending?
discuss.
I would say no. If indeed we're trying to create a reserve, then I would agree to have the equalization at such a point that we create these little amounts that go into the reserve. But my question is, why do we even want a reserve? What would be the purpose of that reserve? And if we really don't define that, then I don't think there should be an extra amount requested by each group that wants the extra spending. I think they're doing it on their own.
Representative Wazaza.
Just to clarify, and I'm not sure if this is John or Julia, this would be like a yearly thing, right? So it's not like a school district approves the supplement once and that's now just like built in. They would have to revote it every year. Okay, just clarifying.
Representative Higley.
Talking about this 80-20 possible or another possibility or whatever. Again, I'd go back to, you know, to me, what, I don't know if you call it a penalty or whatever, again, it's, you know, it's gonna make the districts really consider how important that extra spending is to them, I think, if there was some sort of a split. And as far as the reserve goes, I can maybe understand, especially for the first year, there's gonna probably need to be some tweaks along the way. And if there's some money in there that's built up for that, it would help. As far as the construction costs afterwards, I could maybe agree with you. That's a pretty complicated, you know, item as far as that whole process goes. And it's not a lot of money, but I don't know. At this point, I still think there should be, and what that 80-20 split is, or, you know, 90-10, or I don't know really yet.
Coming from a school district that needs a new school, I'm always looking for new pots of money to help fund or defray the cost of that. So it appeals to me from that perspective, from a school construction aid. But I don't know how much is going to be in that fund if it's even meaningful. So it might be just meaningful to create a reserve for those funds to be raised from the equalization to go into that and then see what we do with it. But I do agree with Representative Burkhart that the penalty is what is borne by taxpayers in paying additional dollars on their property tax in a way, aside from an additional fee beyond that. That's how I personally feel. I don't think the 20% is enough. I want to say enough. I'm not sure the penalties always work.
And my point is that I don't think, I guess maybe I'm just less worried about there being irresponsible spending. I don't think people are, if you could avoid having a school district budget fight, if you could just avoid voting your budget, you would, right? Like anybody who's been on a school board or worked in city government, like knows you do not want to have that fight with your community. And so I think school districts are going to work really hard to try to stay within that educational opportunity. In my mind, school district that's going out for that supplemental district spending is really struggling because of healthcare costs or some kind of emergency maintenance thing that might not be covered by a school construction, fund for years until we get that really stood up and set up. They're going out to raise money because they have to, and to penalize them for doing that just doesn't feel right to me. And I think we still need to keep this completely separate from whatever reserve we're talking about, because to really go and fund school construction, there needs to be a whole mechanism in place. And I think the idea of putting this in a reserve is great. The equalization part going into a reserve, I think is great because it should go to the benefit of everybody in the state some way. I don't think we have to decide right now, this instant, like how those dollars will be spent. I think it's fine to reserve them. But I don't think adding another penalty on top of a situation that's already, in my mind, you're taking that big step of spending the money to go out to the community. Not that you're spending a ton of money advertising, but if we're talking about, I guess if it's town meeting, maybe it's still with city council or city elections and all that other stuff. But if you're having some kind of special election that's just for school supplemental district spending, that's a cost to go and have an election. I'm not sure that you're gonna wanna do that unless you're in a pretty desperate situation. And so why should we be penalizing people on top of that to discourage them? I think they're already the voters discouraging them to do it by voting no at the ballot box if they really don't think it's necessary. And then just the idea of having to vote a budget at all, when you could just not vote a budget.
Representative Bodie.
That's making me think about the nineties. And we would not go, did we go to put a budget on the ballot if we weren't going for a tax increase? I don't think so, did we?
Yeah, always.
In the nineties?
Yeah.
All right. Because I remember,
Foundation that was much smaller then, you had to have local, most of your funding before, probably.
but did we have to okay a budget?
Yes,
You'd think we would have
Yes.
to, because you can't just willy-nilly say, well, the school board's deciding and the public has no say. All right, okay. So there will be a budget on the ballot every year.
Only if you have
Only-
supplemental district
Well,
spending.
then I want to back up to this. That sounded so good. But then now I'm thinking, when you have but now you have a smaller school board possibly. I don't know what the governance is going to look like, but let's just say you don't have a lot of school. Let's just say it's a smaller number of school board members, whatever they're going to be called. And they sit there and every year they make decisions. How does the public ever get to say, yeah, we're okay with that?
This is the local advisory councils that are that are discussed, but haven't been fully fleshed out in
I
terms of
get
what
that.
level of power that those councils.
But would you really? So the public doesn't get, what's the public's chance to say?
Electing the school board.
electing a school board,
But that means school board members.
And then lobbying their state representative as to how much is allocated to the base.
But how much is allocated based, a little different from the decision made by the school board and the advisory council's advice about. I see, so you're saying that the ballot box is the only place that they're going to be able to really whom they elect. That's pretty significant.
Representative Hagan.
So this goes to your point, Representative Buckner, about district having to include in its supplemental district spending healthcare. I would hope that we would include that in the EOP. I mean, that's what we kind of talked about, finding someplace in that base to make sure that that's covered. Because that would be, I think that would be not a good idea to not have it funded enough so that each district had to go into a supplemental spending. But that's just what I would hope we could do in the end, is make sure that somehow that's included in the base.
Well, I think it will likely be included in the base. The question is whether you trust all of us enough to have the right inflator in that base every year to keep up with things like healthcare costs or special education costs or other costs that might be increasing faster than others. And whether you find, because as I think somebody on the other side of the table said, you know, all these costs are fungible, right? We're not saying that the district's going to go out and say, we're raising supplemental districts. I mean, they might frame it that way, but like the healthcare costs bumps up over the budget, but that they're not going to go out to raise their healthcare spending through this supplemental payment. That should be included in the base. So the question is, do we trust future legislatures enough to raise that base amount enough to keep up with the costs that are out of control of the districts? Because you really don't have a lot of control over that. And we have no control anymore because all of the negotiations are done at the state level. All you can control is how many teachers you have, really. And the teachers control like which healthcare plan they choose. And the negotiations at the state level determine how much the district pays versus how much the teacher pays for that health plan. So those costs literally cannot be controlled other than by just cutting staff. And to me, cutting staff means cutting opportunities for kids, for services for kids. So
Representative Mazzazzi?
No, I whispered the point to Representative Odie too of right now, the current dynamic is not, voters just vote their school budget up or down. They're not having that level of input. And yes, through community forums and the floor on town meeting, they're saying, oh, I would spend 10,000 more on a new school bus versus, just that's an example. But I don't think that this new dynamic changes this all that much. And I still think that school budgets writ large would still be communicated to the public. I just don't see it as that big of a shift in terms of the public's input on how the money is spent inside of the budget.
Okay, so we're still coming back to that central question.
Mhm. And buried.
Do we have the penalty or not?
Do we need to straw pull the penalty
We
just to
probably
see where
do.
we are?
Any penalty? Should we have any penalty?
So, trying to see where it is on here.
Should it's BII.
Should every district have to contribute to the reserve above and beyond the amount they have raised? Straw poll.
I still think I think that question is.
You're right, it's a little muddy. Should there be a penalty? I
Should
guess
there be a
should
penalty for
penalty?
raising the supplemental district spending?
Yes.
Just clarification on that again, what are we talking penalty? Are we talking the penalty of the 80% or the 20%?
That's the next question.
The next question is where we should set that level. Yeah. Just should there be a penalty at all?
Already said, too high.
Julia,
Julie Richter, JFO. My understanding is that the question you're currently discussing right now is that district with the lowest taxing capacity. Should they also be paying into the reserve
Yes.
or whatever you're calling it, or not? Every other district is also going to be impacted by that decision because it talks about what are you benchmarking every district's grant list against? Are you benchmarking it against 100% of the district with the lowest taxing capacity, or 80% or 90% or whatever?
I would say it should, that was very well said.
Hasn't run for office yet.
Everybody understand it that way, the way it was asked? So the question is, should that lowest tax capacity district also have to contribute into the reserve? So that's the question.
Representative Maslin.
If that's the question as you phrased it in perfect English, I would say if the lowest spending district where the benchmark begins spends no more than, not even a penny more, and they shouldn't have to pay extra. But as soon as anybody in the district exceeds the benchmark amount, then everybody contributes in a similar manner. Meaning by a percentage is what we've seen to settle on before, right? That's what I understand. That's where I would go.
So I think, Representative, just to clarify your answer, just to make sure they would be, everybody would be contributing from within that district if they were spending above the EOP.
Yeah.
Question is, do you want them to contribute more than just the amount that they're raising over the EOP and the reserve? So that is what we're talking about as a penalty.
That's my understanding.
So do you want them to contribute to the penalty?
If they spend it, the base amount, that's it, then they needn't contribute more.
That's right.
But if it's more, then or anybody who spends more than that, goes against any district, it's all within the district, any school. Then they all contribute in a like manner, percentage wise. That's the way I hear it.
Representative Feltus.
I see two different purposes of this so-called penalty. I think Mark is talking about a penalty that would make one stop and think, do I really want to do this extra spending? So
Exactly.
kind of a decision point. The other part of it is we just want to create another reserve. And I see that as two separate things. And if we just need to create, if we want to spend another $3 million, I think the local voting is enough of a consideration point that we don't need to arbitrarily tell them, now, wait a minute, stop and think, because you're going to have to put a little bit more in than what you really need. If we really want to create a reserve of some kind, and I'm not sure that this is the right place to do that, then yes, I think everybody needs to contribute to it.
Yes.
But my question is, why do we want a reserve in this particular mechanism? What would be the use for that?
Representative Lozada.
I agree. I've been convinced. Discussion has changed my mind. I think that, to Representative Burkhart's point, it's what you just said, Mark, like having to go through the process of an election, having to, having your district's property taxes raised, having to sell that to the voters, having to do the whole rigmarole. I think that's enough of a penalty. Without having to then say, and by the way, even if you do all of that, you have to send 50 grand back to the state or whatever.
Representative Maslin.
I see at this point in time, we have two questions. First, we can divide the question. We say on the floor. First is there a penalty? And I've seemed to have worked through that. And the other one, where does the money go? And the reserve at this point in time isn't gonna amount to much more money for school construction. Ask if we're gonna take money, we need to park it somewhere. And the reserve, if it's gonna be for future school spending or something like that, that is statewide, at least district-wide or statewide use. That seems reasonable, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're gonna build a new high school with this little bit of money we're getting from here and there, but if the question is, does the money go somewhere? It needs to go to somewhere where the district has universal access. We haven't defined access yet, but school construction, following our normal way of figuring that out, whatever that turns out to be, is a good way to start.
Representative Odie.
I'm going to agree with Marty. It really helped me to hear what she had to say, and I say, this isn't the place for penalty. It's enough that they're going out on the ballot. Is that what you're saying? Right, yeah, okay. I would agree with that. Let's not put a penalty here.
Representative Higley.
Well, again, if there's no penalties, there's no reason for a reserve.
Correct.
Well, no, the equalization is still going in.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So there's the penalty, which means that even the lowest tax capacity district has to contribute into a reserve. And we're saying, no, let's not do that. But there's still the issue, I think that we already agreed on, which is that the highest tax capacity district has to raise at this lower amount. So when they go out to raise their excess spending or supplemental district spending, there's still going to be this gap between what they raised and on their big tax base at this lower rate and what they actually wanted to go raise. And that amount, that equalization amount, still needs to be captured somewhere. So there would still be a reserve or someplace to capture that amount. We just wouldn't be then additionally penalizing them, by 10, 20% just because they went out and decided to raise that money. Because otherwise, I don't see how we get around Brigham compliance. If we don't move everybody's tax capacity to the same basis, I don't see how this can be Brigham compliant if we allow somebody with a giant tax base to go out and only put a couple pennies on it. Whereas these guys down here would have to go put 15 pennies on their small tax base. So the equalization, I'm totally on board with. The penalty is where I really got.
Seems to be some consensus. Representative Brandon, what do you think?
Well, I still think this goes back to my very first comment that schools who have low student spending are going to be in a different kind of place here they're gonna be very reluctant to spend more money, especially if there's a penalty for doing it. And they're probably the ones who need it the most. No one's paying attention to that. I'm gonna go visit Holland this, when I get done shivering. I mean, that school,
It's not open anymore.
well, there you go.
You raise a good point,
Right.
because we've talked about, and not necessarily here, but in terms of some communities being under-resourced because folks are really tight with a nickel.
It's the way they are, it's their community.
Yeah, and
Shouldn't they
that's-
be able to do that if they want to?
Yes, except that some of those kids then didn't have the resources that were
I know.
necessary. So that's what the foundation formula should be addressing, right? Theoretically. It's a good point, though. If they're used to spending only 10,000 and now they have 20,000, what are they gonna do? So then we have to look at that. So I don't know if we can answer that from our side. We're in charge of raising the money, but yeah.
I guess, all in all, from listening to the discussion, I agree with Marty.
I have a question for Julia. The equalization piece and the funds that Representative Burkhart is suggesting. Would that be another line item on the Ed Fund outlook page?
Yeah, perhaps, because we're talking about, a chunk of dollars, right, that are sitting in this reserve. And the way that Rep. Burkhardt explained it is exactly how I would have explained it as well, right? You're talking about raising above the foundation amount. So you're bringing everybody up to this level based off of their weighted pupil count. Here are your dollars, that's the education opportunity payment. Then the question is, should school districts spend above? Right?
Yeah.
You answered that, yes. Then the question is, okay, how is that money going to be raised? And we're talking about, to the conversation, two pieces. One is the penalty and one is the equalization. The penalty is essentially saying, we're going to increase your tax rate more so that extra dollars flow to the education fund because you are spending extra. Or because you want every district, even the lowest property wealth district, to be paying into this extra kitty, right? The equalization portion is benchmarking all districts, so that everybody has the same tax rate, the same amount of spending, supplemental spending, regardless of their district grant list. Then there's the whole question of, okay, you put those extra dollars, you've got those extra dollars from the equalization, you decide to do that, penalty, if you decide to do that. Then there's the question of what happens with those extra dollars, but that's a completely distinct question. So those extra dollars, yes, I could certainly put those on the Ed outlook. And what you're contemplating right now is, how are those extra dollars being calculated? And there's another policy question of what happens to those extra dollars.
Julia, one additional question for you. The way we have the property tax credit currently structured, would the supplemental district spending also then be eligible for the calculation of the property tax credit as currently configured?
That's a policy choice. I'm gonna ask John what the language has at the moment.
So, John Ray, Office of Legislative Counsel, the current draft, which includes the homestead exemption, that you could retain this concept for the PTC, but we're not on board with the exemption. Currently contemplates that exemption would be available from both taxes, the statewide education property tax and this supplemental district spending tax. And you could have a similar structure for if you get, but that's what the draft currently says. I don't know that that's something where a thoughtful or official decision has been.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Maslin.
Thank you, Chair. I may be changing my mind on the reserve, so-called. Two considerations. One is if it's actually going to be used for school construction, initially there's only going to be a little bit of it, not very much. If we say the above spending is raised from local voters to the property tax, maybe I'm coming to the conclusion that that's enough. If the people who are gonna raise the money, pay the money. That may be more straightforward than putting it in a reserve that we, who knows if we ever use it. So, being coherent.
Think so. I think what I heard you say is that the penalty may not be warranted to contribute to the reserve. But that in the context of the equalization, that would still go into a reserve.
What would that reserve be if I can put the question back to you?
And currently contemplated in the bill is for it to go into state aid for school construction. So if we want to make a policy choice, not that putting in just a general reserve and not for state aid for school construction, then we would have to do that.
I'm undecided on that.
Yeah.
I was convinced, I think, by Representative Burkhart, Tony, Marty. That the voters want to raise more money. They face they face their own voters, say, if you want to do this, and here's what it's gonna cost us. And it basically goes into spending of what people want to say they spend. This is an old-fashioned town meeting question. We're gonna raise property taxes because we're gonna spend it today on the floor. That's straightforward. It is, what's the word we use? It is, transparent. We know where the money comes from, we know where it goes, that may be sufficient. But they are gonna pay more. That's what they say they wanna do.
Okay, so I think what we have, Mr. Chair, I don't know if you want to do a straw poll, is that hearing consensus emerging is that to not have the penalty for supplemental district spending over the base, but to still use the equalization so that the properties with greater ability to raise money are contributing into a reserve, and that reserve is yet to be decided on how to spend it. Is that what
everybody understands?
I don't think that's what I was trying to say. Oh. But if we see it in print, then it may be terrific, you know?
it was really to talk about removing the penalty is that we've been considering, as there seems to be consensus about removing that penalty. May not be unanimous, but then to still use the equalization process.
Use the equalization process, that seems to be the best way to have it function. Right? I get that.
So, all in favor of not having a penalty for raising money through the SDS?
Again, I'm just struggling without the numbers,
Right?
but I'm conceptually, I understand what we're doing.
Do you want to be counted as a no or an abstain, or how should I calculate this possible?
How about I'm willing to continue the discussion consistent with what the committee is saying, but I'm not, I just think we need to be paying close attention, because we don't. And, I think it makes sense for rating it above the black. You've already penalized it to some extent for high capacity districts, but I just think we may all feel very differently once we see some numbers.
That's right. I'm saying, I think that's just true. Yeah, overall.
So then the next question is, how do we calculate tax capacity? I think we pretty much accepted the approach that JFO has come up with, which is, but I don't want to assume that, which is total grand list value for a school district divided by long-term enrollment. That's not what JFO explained, actually.
Yeah.
And maybe JFO can explain that more clearly.
Yes, it is the school district's total equalized grand list. To your point, I've just emphasizing equalized,
Equalized.
divided by the school district's long-term average daily membership. So not at the school district's enrollment, but it's long-term ADM. Right, it's two different ways of counting kids in the district. Long-term ADM is essentially talking about the number of kids within that district. So it's an important technical distinction. And it's a policy choice, but what you all have been talking about so far is the long-term, the legal name, long-term membership.
Which is not weighted.
Correct.
Unweighted.
As a,
And this is for calculating the rate.
this is for calculating the taxing capacity of the districts, right? So the first step of this whole equalization process is to determine how much grand list, as the bill currently contemplates, and the slides that I put forth explain, the first step is figuring out how much total equalized grand list value is there per pupil in the district. The way that we do that is we say, okay, all grand list value, homestead and non-homestead, at fair market, 100% of fair market value, divided by our metric of counting the number of kids in the district, long-term average daily membership, right? So that's a 2-year average. It's factoring in also state-placed students and a couple other technical additions into that.
Representative Odie.
So this is where I looked at this presentation last night and I don't, what would be the difference between is the weighting taken into account somewhere else? So this is not a place to put the weighted students. This is what I don't get.
Sure, so also a policy choice, right?
Yeah.
All of these are policy choices. The way that we have talked about it thus far, the bill has, bless you, is not including rates, right? It's the grand list value divided by just the pupil count. You could divide it by the weighted pupil count. What you would be doing there is essentially changing the way that you are calculating the district with the lowest taxing capacity, right? So if you have two districts with the same grand list value, one district has more kids than the other, then the district with more kids than the other is going to have a lower taxing capacity, right? The more that you add, the more weights that you add in, the lower you're going to be bringing that grand list per weighted pupil down. So it's just the question to the committee is, when analyzing a school district's taxing capacity, is it the grand list value per pupils, just kids? Or is it the grand list value per weighted pupils, the kids plus accounting for all of the different circumstances of those students and the district, depending on all the weighted choices that are still outstanding?
Okay, so I have a follow-up question to that. So with the weights in the existing formula, with weighted students counted at the same rate, schools are able to raise more money to fund their students. So if we use per pupil instead of weighted pupil, what happens to what I just said?
Sure, so we're talking about a different, just taking a step back. I promise I'll answer your question, but I'm gonna take a step back first and say we're talking about a different part of the calculation than what you're referencing right now.
All right.
So what you had already spoken about was determining how are you calculating the amount raised for the supplemental district spending, and you determined, I believe, that would be a percentage of the EOP. So essentially then you're factoring in those weighted pupils. What we're talking about now is how are we comparing district grand list values, right? If you have a huge district with a ton of kids, a lot of property wealth, and a really small district with only a couple of kids, is that an apples to apples comparison? If you don't think it is, one way to get at it is taking, okay, here's how much grand list value each district has, right? here's how many kids are within the district. We're gonna create an apples to apples comparison by looking at the grand list value per pupil. That's just what we do for per pupil spending, excess per pupil spending. So that's looking at sort of that first step of the equation of which district are we benchmarked against? Which district has the lowest taxing capacity? And so the question is, for calculating that, are we looking at district per kid? Or are we looking at district per pupil? Or are we looking at district per weighted pupil? Everything we've talked about so far is per pupil, not per weighted pupil. And that is a policy choice, just.
Some of the things that come into that is being able to explain it to voters. And I think the simplicity of it is it's easy to say, spend or grand list per kid in the school system. It's the simplest, but it doesn't necessarily recognize the circumstances of those students.
And is that because that's already been factored into the EOP, or is it because, so if we put it in here, would that be double counting it? Or would that not be double counting it?
Is that right?
I'm asking you.
It's really a question of how are you measuring grand list per pupil?
Yeah, I know, I hear what you're saying, it just has to register with me, so I'll just have to take.
So so in terms of, is it double counting, we're really looking at two different pieces of an entire funding system.
Okay, all right.
So we have talked about the EOP and raising a percentage above the EOP. We're still in the world of the supplemental district spending, but now we're in a different piece of it where we're talking about comparing district grand list values.
Okay. Thank you.
So, as currently drafted, it is grand list divided by number of students.
I think my instinct says that that's what my gut says. I probably am one of the least versed in terms of how all of these weights work together, but my instinct says if we're talking about this specific subset,
Yeah.
adding in the weights just adds a complication that is not necessary for this portion of this education funding system that we're designing.
Juice versus squeeze problem.
Right.
Yeah, because if we're talking about this tiny amount on top of the big amount that we've already worked out.
Right.
Yeah. Again, depends what your base is though.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
That's right.
Any opposing thoughts on that?
I would say school total equalized grand list.
Yes,
It is equalized,
right. So divided by the CLA.
yes. And I do have unrated. So, yeah, I'm good.
It seemed like an unofficial straw poll.
You wanna see hands?
No?
Here.
John, do you want to say hands?
And that was a policy choice.
That was a policy choice. All right, so the next question is, when would school districts vote on the supplemental school district spending? In terms of timing.
Is this an us question or a GovOps question?
I think we may have to call legislative council that's been working on the education bill, and Beth St. James that should be willing to comment on this. All right, Beth, could you introduce yourself and opine on this if you could?
Sure, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I will first give you the caveat that I'm the education policy attorney, air elections attorney. Tim and Tucker stand ready to provide you with any advice you need beyond what I am able to provide today. I do think this is a policy question right now. What is being contemplated, but not set in law, is that school board member elections would occur in November on the general election timeline. And that occurs every 2 years. right? And that's for the future state. For our current state, school board elections and budget votes are occurring in spring, if you will. They're occurring at different times after March first through June 30th. And they occur at the same time. So I don't know, I haven't been in the conversation enough to understand when the powers that be that need the information on how much any district is spending above the base amount needs to make it to the administration. I think Julia knows. But your vote's gonna be dependent on that, and it's possible that you're gonna have two different elections.
So just from a budgeting standpoint, we're gonna have to work out all the timelines and look at the
Yes.
stuff and look at all the due dates. But from what I understand, in order for the schools to accurately budget and everything else, they're working at the same kind of schedules to when they need staff and everything else for the following school year, September, October, and that. And so in coming up with what the foundation formula is going to provide them, that should happen in the fall or December theoretically.
Give it up to Julia and John.
And so so without that information, how do you decide on what you want to spend?
Yeah, so, yes. This gets into a question of timelines, when school districts are building their budgets, which fiscal year are they building their budget for? Is it for the following fiscal
Right.
year? Or is it for a future fiscal year that is not the following fiscal year? I'm not sure if the language currently contemplates that. So that's one piece, right? When they're voting on excess supplemental spending, are they voting on it for the following fiscal year or for 2 years out? I think that's a policy choice that still needs to be resolved. If the question is, or the decision were to be, yes, they're voting on supplemental spending for the following fiscal year, the upcoming fiscal year, right now. Budget votes that happen, town meeting and beyond are for the upcoming fiscal year. If that construct holds true, then if you want school boards to be able to calculate what their supplemental district spending tax rate is going to be, they will only be able to do that if they know what the supplemental district spending yield is going to be. And currently, the way that it's drafted in the bill is that yield is going to be included in the December 1st letter. So that gives you at least one date. I think all of the other dates, and that date also is a policy choice, but all the other dates kind of fall from that. Does
Right,
that
Kristen.
answer the question?
Then currently, we have them send board approved budgets to JFO, to the head department.
So currently, school districts begin building their budgets generally in the early fall. But the December 1 letter that comes out that helps inform that, but budgets are pretty far along at that point. And then as school districts start to warn their budgets for voters, which there's statutory guidelines that I would need to phone a friend about what the timelines are for that, but school districts need to warn their budgets a certain number of weeks in advance or days in advance of the vote. And upon warning those budgets, they then send them to the Agency of Education. And then with that updated budget information as it starts to come in, that's when I come in and say, with AOE, and AOE says, here's our latest education spending projection, and then we say, here's the yield. So it's an iterative process.
I understand. Can someone clarify what you mean by school board elections would happen in November? Because that seems incredibly disruptive. I'm just gonna say, because they're right in the middle of finalizing a budget then.
The conversations that have happened in the policy committee, the education policy committee, around the creation of larger school districts revolve around the fact that you could be creating and are likely to create, based on the conversations you're currently having, the largest political subdivisions of the state, larger than any of your representative districts and potentially larger than Senate districts. And the Secretary of State has testified for a recommendation. This is technically policy, but the Secretary of State's recommendation is that the school board elections be done at the same time as general elections. So that, for a myriad of reasons, one of those is, universal vote by mail in the general election. You're no longer having, the school districts are no longer going to be as centralized as they are now. So the thought that there would be one meeting that everyone's going to listen to folks or discuss issues may still happen, but you're gonna have folks that are traveling long distances, and so that may not look the same in the future state. The challenges for town clerks and having to run an election on that scale for those large of a districts off of the statewide election cycle. Because the statewide election cycle, my understanding is a well-oiled machine, if you will. And so if you're going to be doing school district votes off of that cycle, that will have policy implications that are not insurmountable. They're all policy decisions. But what that means for clerks and the people on the ground who are running these elections, it would just be very different than if the elections occurred on the statewide election cycle. There has been discussion about how that is different than how Vermont has historically done that, and when school board elections are historically happening. And again, this is me getting out over my skis as your education policy attorney. But the Secretary of State's office, I'd be happy to send a link to her written remarks from the Education Committee if you're interested in that, about the election implications. But right now, that is the discussion that is happening
Ed or in GovOps?
in education.
Sorry, Carol, that'd be great if you could put that around. And I rescind my earlier comments about the new dynamic not being as.
Representative Odie.
Oh, it's.
I'm wondering if there was any testimony about if you hold the election in November, but you put off the people taking office till the budget cycle's over, what's the law about that?
Oh, I don't know. That would be a great question for me to look into and get back to you on.
Because that could be changed so that the budgeting cycle, the whole thing's over.
That's a bit disrupted.
Yeah.
So I want to remind you that this bill still goes to approach and GovOps. Oh,
Is it going to go up?
I don't know.
There's nothing in it about elections currently, is there?
No, we don't. That depends on the speaker about where it goes. Definitely goes to approach, but not sure
So
about
let's see
anybody else.
if we include the.
Yep.
Where we're telling them when to vote. That should signal GovOps.
But the school district spending tax vote, the supplemental district spending tax would need to be an annual thing. And just based on the time that the districts get their education opportunity payment number to determine whether they need to go out and raise additional money, that would be December, right? So you're still talking a very similar timing in terms of the SDS vote, I would think, as to what we have now. You can't make it a whole lot later than town meeting, because then you run into not knowing whether you can offer contracts to people based on how much budget you have. And you can't do it a whole lot earlier. If you get a December 1 letter to sort of confirm some of these numbers, right now you get that December 1 number and you already pretty much have your budget most of the way there. And by about January 13th, you have to warn that budget to be ready for town meeting day, if you're doing town meeting day. Some people do it a little later. But it's hard to do it much, much later than town meeting, somewhere between town meeting and the end of April.
So hypothetically, your entire board turns over in November.
Right.
And then they've got a budget due.
I thought the board was going to be on staggered.
But I'm just saying weird things happen. Like it could be a majority of the board, like weird things happen. People resign, people, yeah.
Representative Maslin,
No,
raise your hand up.
they go on
Mr. Chair. Several things
Same
that
time budget goes.
may have been involved in this committee. One is initially I was skeptical of the idea of electing school board people in November, but I think I've been convinced it's a new office essentially. We'll get good should have the best turnout. And people can get with the program and figure out what needs to be done and figure out how to vote. As opposed as, on the other hand, when do people vote their budgets? I prefer, as we seem to be saying here, stick with traditional town meeting time. There's enough disruption, enough things turned upside down here. That keeping with the timeline for voting our budgets that most of us are familiar with. When people can gather in school budgets or whatever, or do it by us, Joan, and think town meeting, there's merit in preserving the town meeting timeline for voting on these things. I can't think of a better one. I don't think we want to do it in November. There's enough going on in November to shoehorn something new on top of that budget. So, I mean, that ballot. So I think that's what I generally heard, even though nobody said it.
Well, I mean, yes, there's a lot going on in November, but if you were to vote in November, there's big turnout usually in November, which means more people voting on it. And if you voted the budget for not the following fiscal year, but the year after that, you could do that.
Except it wouldn't be only every 2 years that the
Right.
November election would happen.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So if we stick with the current construct, and we'll have to hear from
2 years.
the people that are in charge of putting together the budgets as to how that would work, to see if the current construct continues to work with a March town meeting or a town meeting vote. Because otherwise, if we try to say 2 years, you get a budget for 2 years, they may say,
I would just also really encourage us to keep in mind that simplicity is sometimes less cost. And just because we make a lot of things super complicated, and I would just encourage people to think of simplicity sometimes.
And what do you think is more simple?
I think if you're now forcing warnings I would like to, I mean, I just looked at Massachusetts, they do both of them this spring, I think they have a foundation for, I don't think it's because we have bigger districts, their districts are way bigger than our districts. But what they're trying to do is keep the elections aligned with the budgets, is my understanding. I would like to research it a little bit better. The reason is the person building the budget defends the budget, and then the offices turn over, don't turn over. There's something about that that's important. And, maybe it makes sense, but, we still have the every 2 years issue. There's just a lot of complexity. If we're gonna have to warn twice and it's different in off years and not off years, we're just adding a lot of complexity. That complexity has to be justified because there's a policy improvement associated with it. If we can't say why things are better for making it more complex, then maybe we shouldn't make it complex.
Just to clarify though, but they wouldn't be voting on the school budget, they would just be voting on the.
Supplemental
Yeah.
districts, whatever,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I understand.
Just making sure we're still in that
And
universe.
part of it, again, I mean, this is all hypothetical, but we don't know what the number is. If the number is really low, every single district is gonna be voting the supplemental district spending, and we're gonna hit our construction goals right out of the gate. So I'm just saying, I'm just saying, we just don't know right now.
well, we've had a great morning of discussion and made several decisions along the way that can help guide us as to what the actual legislation that we drop in looks like on the supplemental district spending. Left on our agenda, and probably not before lunch, is really looking at the homestead exemption. And do we want to still stay within what it currently is or move to what has been presented to us? We're considering. There are financial implications, obviously, about that. As to what it costs. The education fund is currently configured, so we can look forward to having that discussion.
So not so fast.
Oh, pass.
C, are there any parameters that should be put in place to control how supplementary district spending is spent? The limitation,
Yeah, I skipped over that.
I noticed.
Yeah.
A little while ago, I talked about it and I was like, now it's.
I say no.
And I thought there was a general retreat from that very
Yeah.
question, that's why I crossed it off.
Okay,
And I don't know how she did it, but Beth has some initial draft language for us to look around special education. And the genesis of this was if we can't identify and control the drivers of rapid growth, we're actually not going to be able to stay within the foundation. And Beth has some draft language around the report and a plan on special education that it would be great if we could talk through as well.
Beth, can you be here this afternoon?
Yes, I literally am hitting send on an email, lightly cleaned up. And yes, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I forgot what day
That
the
was
week
the
is. I am in Senate Education. I am booked in the Senate from 1:30 to 2:30. You may want to talk to your colleagues in House Education for after that. If they will spare me, I can be here.
After 2:30.
Yes. After 2:45.
Okay. Yeah, and then we will do the homestead exemption
Can we,
discussion before that.
can we put in a request, please, Chair, for, I would love to know what the different inflation indicators are and what is in the base of those indicators. Because if we're going to be putting an inflation adjustment into this, it'd be helpful to know what the options are for that. Is that possible?
Is that a question to me?
Well, I guess it's probably JFO, but we've talked about NEPA. There are others. I would like to know what the NEPA is based on and what some of the others are based on, because I've used other ones in other contexts.
Yeah, so I will say that the inflation indicator that is included is a significant policy choice, right? Because to your point, what is included in the calculation and the assumptions of that inflation index really will impact the inflation index as well as the impact on whatever the inflation index is applied against. Right now, NIPA is used throughout Title 16. I could follow up. I've been talking to the state economist for a bit. I think this is maybe a broader question that I don't know if I can come back to you within the next day about the different inflation indices that you could use. Perhaps that's something to be explored over the summer in terms of the different inflation indices, what the parameters are, because there's a ton of trade-offs about different.
Are you even able to tell us what the basket is under NIPA? Because I've played now with NIPA and some others, and they're pretty different.
Yes, they're very different. The bulk of it, and by bulk I mean more than 50% is compensation. There are other things included in the basket.
Mhm.
It's also based off of national data. It's not Vermont specific. I don't know if I just said this, I'm a little, I don't know what's happening in my brain and what's happening in my mouth.
A little tired.
You're good. So forgive me if I just said this, but I have been talking with Tom Cadet, the state economist, about NIPA and the forecasting of NIPA, and I want to reiterate, it's complex. So I just don't want to promise to be able to come back tomorrow.
Is there, because we're contemplating putting in an inflator in this bill, 245. Are you suggesting we should put a placeholder to then be more clearly defined in January 2020?
I don't want to suggest what you would do. I think that using NIPA would be consistent with the inflation indices across Title 16, and it is a policy question. Is NIPA the appropriate inflation index to be using? There's already some the reference of NIPA throughout statute is actually currently outdated, so it's going to need to be adjusted. It still is referencing an old inflation metric that's no longer published. So I guess what I would say is, from my perspective, it's a topic that I could we could dig more deeply into over the summer for you to evaluate if what you've put in now is reflective of the intent.
So we gotta have some language that authorizes us to do that, or.
that's a boot and suspenders, that's a suspender.
yeah.
We need to evaluate and choose an appropriate inflation adjuster before we move forward.
That would be before the foundation formula is effective.
Yes,
Yeah.
100%.
For the effective.
And even in calculating when we project the first year.
Yes.
And it's bugging me because I can't find it. One of our pieces of testimony early in the session, I want to say it was in January, I want to say it was someone like Tammy Colby, I'm not sure it was Tammy Colby, I feel like it was on that day that we had that long list of testimony from a lot of really smart people. Somewhere in a slide, somewhere, or a couple of slides, there were these different inflation indicators, and I haven't been able to locate it yet. But there were like, here are the choices
Yeah.
that go along with them. I don't think they had the details of like what was in every single one. But I want to say it was,
I think it might
I
have
just
been.
haven't had a chance to get through everybody's reports, but it's bugging me because I feel like we've seen it somewhere.
And we need to get ahead of it because I was playing around with a couple different options yesterday. The impacts are quite significant when you start applying them across school districts and across the state. So we need to know what we're doing.
Do you know if that was Rebecca Sedalia or if it was?
It could have been, that's the day that I'm feeling
Yeah.
like it was vaguely in my mind as that day, so I just want to go back.
I think it was her.
Okay, before we go to lunch, Representative Kimball,
Yes, sir.
are we allowed to meet at 1 and not go on the floor?
Good question.
We might need to be,
May need to be on the floor.
we might
One
need to,
bill.
Well, we'll hear a roll call though,
but, right.
if there is one.
I don't know the answer to that question if we have special dispensation, but I will certainly inquire. Why don't we plan on communicating by text
Sure.
as to whether or not we can do that? Is that okay?
So you will be the social equivalent and you will let us know by text.
I'm gonna go run after it, yeah.
Charlie/sources.
Okay, back here.